Alright, so for this video, this is the last one in our series here on John David Ebert 101. And the theme of this one will be on The Age of Catastrophe, which is the title of a book that I wrote back in 2012. So this has been 10 years now that has gone by, roughly. And so this gives me a chance, in a way, to go back and look at some of the predictions that I made in that book based on my study of environmental science and global warming, which at the time that I wrote that book, I knew nothing about. Global warming was just, as it is, I think, for most people, just some vague, ominous thing that you can't do anything about anyway, so why worry about it? And anyways, let's go to the movies and go out to eat, whatever. So you live your life and you can ignore it. But as I began to sit down and study it in earnest, I began to realize that it's way, way, way worse than most people realize. It's pretty awful. And so I checked some facts and figures today to get it that I haven't bothered with. Ever since I wrote the book, I have a tendency to write a topic and then just walk away from it, and I don't go back to it unless somebody wants me to speak on it or something. Back when I wrote the book, now the key thing here, now the reason I'm focusing on global warming, which isn't the only disaster that I wrote about in the Age of Catastrophe, I sort of divided, you've heard me talk here previously about the three different modernities, modernity itself down to World War II, and then post-modernity down to 1995, and then hyper-modernity. In that book, I wasn't thinking in those terms as far as hyper-modernity went. So I was thinking of paleo-modernity as my word for modernity, which is a term that I sort of borrowed from Lewis Mumford's Paleotechnic, and then neo-modernity for post-modernity, basically. And the accidents and disasters that take place in those two epochs are quite a bit different, structurally speaking. And then finally, simply the age beginning from around 2000 of the Age of Catastrophe, of global disasters. I see the disasters. The book starts with the Titanic and the Hindenburg, which are local, containable accidents whose effects do not go on ramifying into the future. I started with that, then looked at catastrophes like Bhopal in India, the Severin gas leak, and the space shuttle, the two space shuttle explosions, and so forth, and the disasters during that period, which, and Chernobyl, of course, which ramify out across generations. There are unborn children from Chernobyl who will still keep carrying on birth defects from that disaster. So the disasters begin to get larger in both time and space in what I called in that book neo-modernity, which is simply post-modernity. And then with 2000, and then later I drew the date for hypermodernity at 1995, so that would be what I would call the epoch now. Hypermodernity, the accidents get gigantic. The BP oil spill, the Sichuan earthquake in China, and we had, I think, 3 tsunamis over the course of a decade there, 3 huge tsunamis, such as the huge one in the Indian Ocean there that brought YouTube into being, actually, for people to upload their images of the disaster that killed, I think, 300,000 people. What was that, in 03? Something like that. And then so that third section is what focuses on global warming, which I see as the largest disaster that we have facing us, which is essentially the collision of industrial civilization with the biosphere, or with the planet itself, which is perfectly prefigured by the Titanic off the coast of Newfoundland crashing into a 10,000-year-old chunk of Greenland ice. Because Greenland ice is a huge issue here. The ice is melting on Greenland and the West Antarctic ice shelf, and the sea levels are rising and will continue to rise no matter what we do. And this is the one thing where the liberal left, which I'm completely sick of, but the liberal left thinks that we can do something to stop this. You can't. That's just the cold, hard, sober truth of it. No matter what, there's nothing we can do to stop this. It is going to happen. It is 100% predictable. Like the engineer says in the movie Titanic about the sinking of the ship, it is a mathematical certainty. She is made of iron and she will sink. Same logic here. You can't get around the mathematics on this. And the key thing has to do with 3 variables. So now we're looking at the future. We've looked at the past with Spengler and Gebser, and the evolution of shamanism and so forth. So now I want to spend a minute or two here on looking at the future. And there are three important variables that have to be kept in mind. CO2 levels are the crucial thing here, because CO2 levels are what we are outgassing from the burning of fossil fuels. These are fossil fuels that we have dug up from the Carboniferous epoch, which is about 350 million years ago. Huge forests for the first time during that epoch came into being. And so we're living off of that, what Tom Hartman calls ancient sunlight. We're living off of ancient sunlight, trapped in those leaves. So we're extracting that. In the relationship of CO2 to global average mean temperature, so CO2, sea level, and global average mean temperature, all three of these variables are interconnected. Now, when I wrote the book 10 years ago, in 2012, I remember checking, there's a website, CO2 Now, where you can check the levels of CO2, and then it was at 392 parts per million, which is very high. But I checked it today now, so we're just about 10 years later, and it's gone up to 417 parts per million, which may not sound dramatic, but it actually is. It's a very alarming figure. By 2050, it will have risen to 450 parts per million. By 2100, at least 500 parts per million, if not more. And 500 parts per million is a point you don't want to get to, because it acidifies the oceans at that point. And when the oceans become acidified, it kills off all the algae. And the algae play a great role in pumping down CO2. Plants love CO2. They pull it down. But we're also deforesting the planet. So we're taking away the Earth's air conditioning system and its system for pumping down excess CO2. And so I also checked the global average mean temperature rise, which had risen to 0.8 of a degree in 2012 when I wrote the book. Now it's 1.02. So it has gotten warmer in direct conjunction with the CO2. However, here's what I want to do is to demonstrate this. The CO2 that's there now has been pumped catastrophically fast, way faster than would be the case for an average geological event like an erupting volcano or something. Back in 1900, it was 280 parts per million, which is something the Earth likes. During ice ages, the Earth cycles it down to 180 parts per million. The planet, Gaia, I suppose if we want to use that New Age term, has been, over the past 2.5 million years, cycling between glacial and interglacial periods, trying to cool herself off. And she likes that number. She wants it down to 180 parts per million or thereabout. So we have pumped over 100 more ppms of CO2 into the atmosphere in just a century. We're going to put 100 more at least in there by the end of this century, up to 2100. And so there's something called climate inertia, though. We put it in the atmosphere so quickly that the climatic conditions have not yet caught up. In other words, the sea level rise and the temperature rise have not yet caught up with it. So based on the amount that's there, and you can't take it down, don't let some liberal idiot try to tell you that you can take it down. You can't. It would take centuries and centuries and centuries to pump that CO2 back down. There's simply no way to get rid of it once it's up there. And we are not going to stop. We are going to burn all of our fossil fuels to the last drop, which we've got about another 45 years or so of left. And we're going to put it all in there. Something like 3,000 more gigatons of CO2 will go into the atmosphere. And so climate inertia it has to catch up, as we'll see here. I'm going to take a look at my poetry book archive, which is the history of the Earth, a cosmogonic poem, as I've called it. It's a history of all the geological phases of the Earth. But what I want you to take a look at here is the relationship between CO2, global average mean temperature, and the sea level. So we start with the Hadean epoch, when the Earth is forming itself, 4.6 to 4 billion years ago. That's the period when it forms its basalt and granite crusts. Those come into being, the iron core, and so forth. Then it moves into the Archean epoch, which is 4 billion to 2.5 billion years ago, when the ocean forms as the result of meteorites slamming into the Earth, bringing ice crystals with them that then melt and gradually form water and gradually form the ocean. And we get the first bacterial cells coming into being during that epoch. In the Proterozoic epoch, which follows it, which is 2.5 billion to 540 million years ago, we get lots of different kinds of bacteria, especially blue-green cyanobacteria, which invents photosynthesis for itself, and also red algae. And they build huge colonies of stromatolites. That goes on for a very long, long time. The only living things on the planet really being these bacteria for a very long time. Then we get the Cambrian Explosion, and this is the key turning point about 540 million years ago to 485 million years ago, when we get this explosion of tiny animals. Only one that does not fit in the palm of the hand, the T-Rex of the period, Anomalocaris, which is a 3-foot-long monster that's hunting trilobites. That's the only big one. The rest you can hold in the palm of your hand. Trilobites and the first tiny little fish from which we evolved. And the fish looks to me pretty much, these early fish like Hycoichthyes look like worms that have been flattened laterally. So we have evolved from these worm-like creatures in good Kundalini fashion, let's say. So there's that period, and then we have an Ordovician period, 485 to 443 million years ago, and then we have the Silurian period, 443 million to 459 million years ago, in which fish who hitherto have been preyed upon by the arthropods, which have been winning the battle in the oceans for food, and they've been preying on fish who just have these tiny little sucker mouths. Some brilliant genius fish amongst them decides to invent for itself a jawbone. It shifts a gill bone forward, and it becomes a lower hinged jaw. So now it can chew food. And now the fish start getting the upper hand. They start getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Pretty soon they're gigantic, and the arthropods are out of the running. Then in the Devonian period, 419 to 358 million years ago. Now the CO2 during this period was very, very high, 2,200 parts per million. But keep in mind that there's no life on land yet at this point. These fish, giant fish like Brontoichthyes and huge arthropods like Brontoscorpions are combating with each other in the water. And this age ends with an apocalypse. A huge catastrophe takes place. And then as it shifts into then the Carboniferous, from whence we're getting all of our fossil fuels, 358 to 298 million years ago, the CO2 has come down a bit, down to about 1,700 parts per million. Now note the sea level is 100 meters higher than our sea levels are today. That's a lot of water. And I believe there's no ice at all. The Arctic ice was completely melted, no ice at either of the poles. It's all pretty much water and one giant continent, Pangaea, that now is populated with huge forests for the first time. And the CO2, 1,700 sea level, 100 meters higher, temperature was 4 degrees hotter than it is today. So very hot, a lot of CO2, but the epoch gradually, probably because of all these forests now, which can pump down CO2, brings it down by the end of the epoch to about 375 parts per million, about where it is now. Even actually less than where it is now. And this is the age of gigantic insects, dragonflies with 3-foot-long wingspans. There's a lot of oxygen in the air, a lot more than our 21% concentration, and it's fueling these insect monstrosities. And the only reptiles that we have are small ones, lizards and the first snakes and so forth. So this is an age of insects, of giant insects. And then we have the scorpions were about the size of dogs, for instance. Then we have the Permian epoch, 298 to 251 million years ago, where now the reptiles start getting quite a bit larger. Sort of early rough draft versions of dinosaurs start coming in. Nothing terribly impressive yet. Then there's the great extinction event, one of the 5 great extinction events, the Permo-Triassic apocalypse, in which a whole bunch of volcanoes start spewing forth CO2 into the atmosphere, and then it pumps all the way back up to where it had been, to 1,700 ppms, very high, and the sea level is 220 meters, so it's even higher actually. That's probably as high as it could ever possibly get. And the global average temperature was 18 degrees hotter than it is today as the Triassic begins and the age of the dinosaurs. They liked it hot. So these creatures flourished in this environment. But notice the correlation between the high temperatures and lots of CO2. That's a direct correlation there. This all cycles through the Jurassic and then into the Cretaceous, where during the Cretaceous, the sea levels are about the same. The CO2 is a little bit less, 1,200 ppms, and the temperatures correspondingly is a little bit less. It's 10 to 15 degrees hotter rather than 18, which correlated at 1,700 ppms for CO2. So the dinosaurs get wiped out, and then it shifts into the age of the mammals, with first the Paleocene and the Eocene. The Eocene, by the way, is one of my favorite periods, and it's very little known about. 50 million years ago, when the Earth saw its largest mammals ever. The proto-rhinoceros, which did not have a horn, but it was 20 feet tall. It was a massive, I think it's the largest mammal ever to walk the Earth. This thing was huge. The proto-rhinoceros, and also a rather comical creature. A lot of people don't know this. The prototype for pigs were actually carnivorous, terrible, horrible-looking creatures with fangs, spindly legs. They're unbelievable. They look like something out of a horror movie. The prototypes for pigs, and there's another creature called a Calicotherium that just looks like a total impossibility. It's got a horse's head, but it's basically a sloth with almost like a gorilla's body, and it just likes to sit and chew leaves from trees, and what sort of walks on its knuckles. Some very fascinating animals during this epoch. But now, so the temperature was 5 degrees warmer than it is today, and the CO2 correspondingly 1,000 ppms. Note this again: the CO2 levels go down, the temperature goes down. There's a direct correlation. Don't let anybody tell you that there isn't. The Oligocene Gigantomachy, it's the Oligocene. And then finally, we come down to the Pliocene, about 3 million years ago. This is the age of Lucy and the first Australopithecines, in which CO2 is about where it is today, 400 ppms. And the temperature is 3 degrees hotter, and the sea level 25 meters higher. So here's coming back to my point about climate inertia. This is where the global mean temperature will be correlating with 400 ppms and the sea level 25 meters higher, which is a lot. I forget what it's 3 feet per meter, so that's a lot. It's a lot higher. And so because of climate inertia, it has not gotten 3 degrees hotter, but it's going to. By the end of this century, it will be 3 degrees hotter. Mark Linus has written a book called 6 Degrees, where he examines what the Earth will look like with each increase of degree all the way up to 6, and it gradually becomes uninhabitable and completely unrecognizable to us. And so that is where we're headed. And the Eemian period, 125,000 years ago, the CO2 was even less. It was 300 ppms, and it was 1 degree hotter. 1 degree. And as I said when we started, the global average mean temperature has risen by 1 degree, 1.02 actually, in a century here. Sea levels have risen by 1 foot in a century, but that is going to exponentially increase. James Hansen, the IPCC gives the conservative estimate that sea level rise will be no more than 3 feet by 2100, but of course, in 3 feet of water, our planes will not be able to land and take off in the airports, which are at the outliers of the city. Wall Street, as we saw with Hurricane Sandy, will be completely underwater. So James Hansen of NASA calculated the rate of ice melt at the end of the Ice Age 14,000 years ago, and he calculated it that every 20 years the glaciers melted and the sea levels rose by 1 meter. So that translates into 5 meters per century, which is 15 feet, which is probably the reality of where it's going to be by 2100, about 10 feet in there somewhere, 10, 15 feet. You can say bye to all our coastal cities at that point. Bangladesh will be underwater, New Orleans will be underwater, Holland will be underwater. Holland might, because of their precociousness, they might invent floating cities, but I can't imagine that they would be very livable or very much fun. The human body needs contact with the earth. It's an etheric body. If it gets isolated for too long from contact with the earth, you start getting mental illnesses that increase quite a bit. So I don't see that those are viable at all. And plus there will be a lot more hurricanes. I checked to see today if there would be more hurricanes have been getting worse. And what I found was that they have indeed doubled. Since the year 2000, hurricanes have gotten worse and worse and worse, bigger and bigger, and more ferocious in intensity, because a hurricane is basically a system by means of which the Earth is trying to take heat out of the water and throw it into the atmosphere. The ocean is trying to rid itself of excess heat. That's what hurricanes do. And the hottest years on record, back when I wrote the book in 2012, were 2003, 2005, 2010, and 2011. Now they are the last 7 years. As I checked today, if you pull up a bar graph showing the evolution of the hottest years, they go up like this, a curve. Each year gets hotter than the one before it. The two hottest years on record now are 2020 and 2016. They're getting hotter and hotter and hotter and hotter as the CO2 rises, which will cause the sea levels to rise, which will drown all of our coastal cities. All of them. New York, Miami. Miami's at sea level, so it's not going to be around long. And then eventually the West Coast cities as well. It will also desertify the entire United States. The Southwest is already a desert, but it will get even hotter. Phoenix will be uninhabitable. Places like Dallas, Austin, they're gone. They're going to be totally unlivable, uninhabitable. And the Midwest will go back to a Sahara-type desert. So the populations will have to move north. They'll have to leave cities. We'll have a huge refugee crisis as the century unfolds, of people leaving cities looking for someone to take them in, and there isn't going to be enough room in these cities to take these people in. But the populations will need to migrate to northern hemispheres, into Canada, into Greenland as the ice melts. That'll be new coveted real estate there. Trust me, Denmark is not going to hold on to Greenland very long. It's not a military power, and that's going to be valuable real estate there. And Siberia, of course, also. These will be the places of cooler latitudes where people will have to move and migrate as these cities drown. Note too that Oswald Spengler, both Spengler and Rudolf Steiner, said that the future belongs to Russia. And I noticed and I realized that Russia's capital is Moscow, and it's landlocked. So it doesn't have to, it's one of the few capital cities in the world that does not have to worry about global warming. St. Petersburg will be drowned. It'll be underwater. It was built specifically so that Russia could have access to a port city, but that's going to be underwater. Moscow, however, will not. So these are some of the predictions, and I'm glad to see that some of the predictions, not glad actually, but that some of the predictions that I made in Age of Catastrophe have indeed come to pass. I warned about all this stuff, that the storms would get worse, or earthquakes also would increase, and so forth. So that's the planet that we're looking at as we keep coming back in reincarnations. Every time we come back, we're going to come back to a rougher and rougher place. So we have that to look forward to with respect to our future lifetimes. So that's it for John David Ebert 101. That should give you a pretty sizable overview of my basic ideas and worldview.